2 days after the murders, the car was tested. Simpson's blood was found, but there were also traces of both victims' blood. Particularly noticeable were the bloodstains on the center console, labeled as items 30 and 31. Item 30 was found to be only Simpson's blood. But like the sample from the gate, when the blood evidence in the Bronco was re-examined 3 months later, it had also changed. In particular, the results from the console were now very different. Item 30, relabeled as 303 and 306, was now found to be a mixture of Simpson's, Ron Goldman's and Nicole's blood. 304 and 305 also differed from the original analysis. And 305 could only have been made with a hand wet with fresh blood. So how did the stains get there? If they were made by either of Simpson's hands, then the hands had to be covered in blood from both himself and the victims. But if that's the case, then everything else he touched, like the door handle, steering wheel, or light switch, should also be smeared with the same mixture. But these smears are all just Simpson's blood alone. If the stains were made with Simpson's right hand, and he was still wearing the glove, then the finger area of the glove should have his blood on the fingertips as well as blood from the victims. However, Simpson's blood is not found on the fingertips at all, nor is that mixture of all three of them found anywhere else in the vehicle.
We both think that that blood, those finger marks, were put on that console at a later time. They were not on that console at the time of the murder. The area they're in, I would say, is impossible for those finger marks to be put onto that console without either the console being removed or the seat being removed. And the reason I say that is because the finger marks, if they were facing downwards, you might say, okay, that's a possibility, but they're not. The finger marks are facing upwards. You can't do it with the right hand, unless you've got an extremely flexible wrist and you can turn your hand at right angles. It's got to be your left hand, which means the elbow and forearm have got to be below the hand. They wouldn't be able to do it because they wouldn't get their elbow and forearm low enough for their hand to put the finger marks in that position.
So, with serious doubts over the blood from the Bronco, the gate and the socks, does this mean that the police were actively sweetening the case against Simpson? Numerous allegations have now surfaced about LAPD officers planting evidence. Detective Mark Furman, the racist officer who discovered some of the most important clues, was involved in cases where suspects were beaten and reports were falsified. Questioned under oath, he pleaded the Fifth Amendment, the only way in an American court to avoid giving an answer.
Detective Furman, have you ever falsified a police report?
I wish to assert my Fifth Amendment privilege.
Detective Furman, did you plant or manufacture any evidence in this case?
I assert my Fifth Amendment privilege.
And there were other disturbing aspects to the police evidence. Simpson's defense team also alleged that some of the blood taken by the police after his interview had gone missing. And they discovered that all the main blood samples were taken away by one detective.
We learned in the criminal trial that a lead detective had a vial of Mr. Simpson's blood. That alone, in any other case less controversial than this, would have been enough to have the case if that had been discovered as it was here, then the case would be over, literally. But we learned in the civil case, which went against Mr. Simpson, nevertheless we learned that that same senior detective had gone to the coroners and asked for and received samples of the victim's blood. And therefore, the blood of all the principals, that's 100% of the blood types found in this case, on the fence, on the ground, on gloves, on socks, on clothing, in the car, the universe of blood in this case, samples of which were in the hands of at least one senior detective, thus violating the chain of evidence, absolutely, violating every safeguard, every tradition, every expectation on the part of the prisoner at the bar, not admitted freely, but dug out by a highly active and aggressive defense team.
Simpson, would you please stand and face the jury?
So despite Simpson's blood at the scene and his lack of an alibi, there are now reasonable doubts about the evidence at all three crime scenes.
Superior Court of California, County of Los Angeles, in the matter of the people of
When the
state of
verdict came,
California versus
America
Simpson,
stopped
case
to
number
watch,
BA09
and the result split the nation.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of
Some hailed the result as a victory over a system that would do anything to secure a conviction. His defense team believed that there was a wider pattern of police corruption. Whatever evidence may have been manipulated, a year later Simpson faced another trial, this time in the civil courts. In this case, brought by the victims' families, dramatic new evidence emerged. The main set of bloody footprints by the bodies and down the path to the rear was made by a style of Bruno Magli shoes, of which there were only 300 pairs sold in the United States. Under oath, Simpson denied owning a pair.
A photographer in Buffalo, New York, where Simpson played football for the better part of his career, heard about his testimony regarding the shoes and started rummaging through photographs that he had of O.J. Simpson. And sure enough, he has this picture of Simpson wearing what appear to be these Bruno Magli shoes. And what was remarkable about the photograph is that you could actually see the sole. Simpson was reported in the article as saying that it was a complete fraud, it was laughable. Somebody doctored the picture with digital equipment, and that it's not the shoes that he wore that day. Right before the end of the trial, another photographer in Buffalo came forward with 30 more photographs of Simpson wearing the same shoes on the same day. And to top it off, a photo included in that group of 30 of him wearing the shoes was published in a newspaper put out by the Buffalo Bills organization 9 months before the murders. So now we had the photo in a newspaper, a matter of public record, meaning it was impossible for anybody to have doctored these photos.
Simpson lost the case and was ordered to pay the families of the victims millions of dollars. The family's lawyers had successfully argued to the civil trial jury that Simpson owned a pair of Bruno Magli shoes. So could Simpson have been at the crime scene with or after someone else? Dr. Henry Lee believes he has found evidence that supports the idea of two people at the murder scene.
At the scene, we notice another set of a shoe print, also on the Bundy walkway, with parallel line design. It's a smaller size, about 10.5. It's not one, it's quite a few, which indicative that's a trail. It's not a random deposit.
Dr. Lee was told that none of the shoe prints from the police officers or other officials at the scene matched this parallel line design.
It could be a second person, another suspect. That's a possibility. Could be a witness, another possibility.
Simpson's defense team also unearthed a third possible shoe print, this time leaving the scene heading onto Bundy Drive. So is there an explanation that makes sense of all this evidence that points away from Simpson as the killer, and yet explains the footprints and the blood at the scene? Private Eye Bill Deere thinks he has some answers, and tonight reveals his findings.
From watching the trial, there's no doubt in my mind he came to the crime scene. But to me, he came after the murders.
Deere wondered whether anyone else could have caused Simpson to go to the scene. After investigating other possible suspects, he homed in on just one, Simpson's son from his first marriage, Jason.
Then I picked up the phone and called my source. I said, find out if there's any record at the police department of Jason Lamar Simpson ever being interviewed by the police department. He said, no, they never interviewed him. I said, what? Are you really telling me they never interviewed him? Never interviewed him. So I said, okay, I've got to look further. I go down to the city and I look up criminal records. I found that at the day of the murders, that Jason Lamar Simpson was on probation.
Deere discovered that Jason, a chef, had been put on probation for a violent attack on an employer, Paul Goldberg. He also found that Jason had other convictions, including drunken driving and hit and run.
Talk to Ms. Goldberg.
Great. What you found out there?
Deere and colleague Herman King tracked down Mrs. Goldberg, who witnessed the attack.
But she said he worked for us about 3 or 4 months, and one day he called in and said, I can't come in, I'm sick. And then 2 of the other cooks came in and said, hey, I saw Jason at a basketball game. Next day, Jason shows up and said, I'm back to work now. I think I'm going to quit, and I want to be paid for being off, for being sick. And Paul said, no, I'm not going to pay you for being off. You were at a basketball game. He said, you're going to pay me. And said his face started lighting up. Said, you're going to pay me. You owe me. And Paul said, no, I'm not going to pay you, and turned to walk away.
What?
And said all of a sudden Jason came run up behind him and hit him from the back and was hitting him from the back, and when he fell down, Jason was stomping him with his foot. Next thing you know, he reached for a knife, one of the kitchen knives or chef knives.
Right.
And she said the police were called and said Jason was arrested, and the charges were filed. When they went to court, she said that the charges were lowered to a misdemeanor, but he was fined and placed on probation.
After many interviews with people who knew Jason, Deere discovered that he had a troubled past and a history of violence. Aged 15, Jason had even attacked a statue of his father with a baseball bat. For Deere, the key question now was whether Jason had a confirmed and convincing alibi. On the night of the murders, 24-year-old Jason was working as a chef at Jackson's restaurant in Beverly Hills.
He was known by the people that worked there, and pretty well liked too, if I remember right. And as like most chefs, he had his own utensils, his knives, and as I remember, they were all accounted for.
According to the police, Jason had a watertight alibi. He was cooking until late that evening.
We've established that he was with people that spoke for him, that they were with him, and his times were accounted for. So he was eliminated as a suspect very quickly.
Well, I've always taken a position, you never assume, you always verify. So I went to the restaurant. I then am talking to the waitresses, and I said, I was in on the 5th, I think it was the Sunday before, and I named the date because it was June 12th when Nicole and were murdered. And I said, you had hardly anybody here. And she said, yeah, we were lucky we had 20, 25 people. We started closing right after July on Sunday, lack of business. Well, all of a sudden my mind's clicking, and I knew then that, hey, something wrong.
So how early did the restaurant shut that night? Deere tracked down a former waiter at Jackson's to find out.
What time do you think they would have shut down if there was no business on June 12th?
There was no business like on Sunday. Even now we're a little busy, like 9:30 kitchen starts breaking down.
If on Sunday night, June 12th, and there was only 20 to 25 people, then you'd shut down, what, 8:30, 9?
9.
You'd leave early.
So if the restaurant shut as early as 9, who could give Jason his alibi? Jason himself has given an account